All right, people. So like I said earlier, we have an amazing guest today. A very, I want to say unique, yeah. And you're going to understand why I use that word, right? Because what she does is by definition, basically.
By definition.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's very unique and something that we really need to hear about. The story as well, everything is like, yeah. So I'm just going to allow Sasha to please introduce herself.
Okay.
Yes.
So my name is Sasha Henriques. I'm a principal genetic counsellor and a PhD researcher at Cambridge. Around genetics and equity is kind of my thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Brent needs to put the mic a bit
It's
closer.
It's not good.
There we go.
I never normally need a mic closer to me, so you might pull it away again a bit later.
All right, then. All right, so before we get into actually what that means, yeah,
Sure.
we usually play a game with all of our
Okay.
guests, right? Obviously, you weren't told about this
No.
for good reason, right?
Right.
And basically, it's just it's called 140. We asked a series of questions of 140 tempo beat. You don't have to rap or nothing.
Thank goodness.
Some of the questions are like preference questions, so
Okay.
kind of like I don't know, this or that, whatever.
Sure.
And some are actually general knowledge, have real answers. Yes, and there is a leaderboard.
Wow.
So yes, yeah. Are you ready?
Well, let's do it.
All right then. So Brent, when you're ready, please.
Remember, if you don't know it, just say pass
Yes.
so we can move on to the next one. Very
Okay.
quickly,
That's the
There'll be a lot of passes. No.
All right.
Oh, also the preference questions.
Yeah.
You get 1 mark for.
Oh, you get a mark just for making a preference.
Exactly.
That's going to be where my marks are.
The other ones, you get 3 points. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, okay.
Yes. Remember, you're basically operating in Cambridge. So
Are they going to be about Cambridge?
No, I'm expecting a certain level.
Okay, because we're going to get into my relationship with Cambridge
All
later.
right,
So,
then.
like...
All right then. All right. So Brent, when you're ready,
All right. 3,
60 seconds.
2, 1.
A saddlery sells items for the use of what animal? A saddlery.
Horses.
What are the first letters of the word xylophone?
XYL.
Okay. Knowledge or power?
Knowledge.
Who is the British actress known for her role as Hermione Granger in Harry Potter?
Oh, Emma something. Watkins Watson.
Who is the British author known for the book Noughts and Crosses?
Oh, Mallory Blackman.
Love or Lust?
Love.
Who helped Malcolm X write his autobiography?
Pass.
Gillian Joseph presents the news at 10 on what platform?
I don't know. ITV.
Online or in-store?
Online.
What's the capital city of Ireland?
Dublin.
What British filmmaker directed 12 Years a Slave?
Pass.
Hardbacks or audiobooks?
Audio.
Who founded the UNIA?
Pass. Oh, no. Marcus Garvey.
Yes. Where's Haiti?
Where's Haiti?
Yeah.
In the Caribbean.
Hey,
Hey, you started off strong.
I'm telling you.
Well done.
I'm
A
impressed.
lot of pointless with my nan.
I'm impressed, you know. I can't wait to actually do the scores and see what you did. But
Yeah.
I think you did really well. And I'm glad you went back for the Marcus Garvey.
I
one
know.
as well.
I said pass. I'm like, why am I saying pass? I know that.
This is going to be interesting. Sace's record at the top, maybe. Let me not speak too soon.
Nah.
Nah,
That's
calm down.
untouched.
Calm down.
Don't do that.
But yes, all right. Again, Sasha, thank you so much for coming in
No problem.
and speaking to us. Please, again, tell the people what you do, and then let's get into what it
Okay.
actually means.
So my profession is that I'm a genetic counsellor, principal genetic counsellor. But what I'm doing right now is PhD research.
Okay.
And so I work clinically with patients who have genetic conditions. But my research is working with actual researchers kind of about their behaviour and the choices that they make. So it's like social science is my research.
Is that research linked to the genetics as well, though?
So everything I do is about genetics. The research is linked in that I've always had questions about my patients and where we get information about how to treat the patients. And that comes from research. And so then my research led me to, well, why don't I think about a different part of the journey of that knowledge and how it gets to the clinic?
Okay.
And so, yes, they're related, but they're very separate things. One is
Okay,
about
cool.
in the hospital and one is about in the labs before we even get knowledge in the hospitals.
Because when you mentioned the whole social science, I was thinking, are you basically saying some of our actions is linked to, or you are saying that?
Okay. So the social science is the method.
Okay.
So the scientists in the lab are absolutely doing genetic science in the lab. What I'm thinking about is the way that you do science, the questions that you ask, even the things that you choose to research, there's a social structure around that. And some of those social structures are kind of racism and power and all of those things. So does the way that a scientist does their work affect the equity of the genetics that we use on the ground, the tests that we actually use for patients? So it's the social science of how they behave.
Okay.
Yeah.
And obviously, you're basically saying it does affect it. And so you're setting out ways to kind of show and prove this.
Yeah, it's not a position of neutrality.
Yeah.
Which, that's essentially why I've come to that, because from experience, I know that we don't live in a neutral world, and that even if you want to do something that you think is as objective as science, there are still people doing the science. So how does that affect the type of science that we do, and therefore how that science is used for different people, particularly people who look like me?
What would you say to somebody that says to you, okay, cool, I hear what you're saying,
Yeah.
but is your attempt now to try and do the opposite of what they're doing? Or what makes you the authority to make it neutral? If that makes sense.
I don't think I'm trying to make it neutral.
Okay.
I think I'm trying to platform where I'm being transparent about where that neutrality doesn't exist and the effect that it has.
Okay.
So there are lots of institutions that would like to write equity policy, EDI policy about what should happen, but without understanding actually how scientists are kind of challenged and what they do and how those systems actually affect them. You're just writing paper for writing paper's sake. You can write strategy all day long, culture will always win. So I just feel like culture is the thing that you have to think about first before you think about effective strategies to make things fairer.
So you feel like it's imperative for people like us to be in those spaces to kind of inform certain things there. So what would you say to somebody who then says, okay, cool, I think the best way is to separate and do our own thing? You know what I'm saying? As opposed to actually trying to be part of the system that doesn't really want us there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And because I have a scientist mind, I want evidence of all of those things. So I'm not saying that position is wrong. It may be right. It may be right in particular circumstances. So I need to understand all of that to talk about when that's right and when that's not. There's a lot of work around gathering African DNA. And so some of that objective is get African scientists to do that because of the history of exploitation. So there are absolutely places where these need to be self-owned, self-governed, and there are other places where we need collaboration or we will be left behind. So it's about kind of understanding the lay of how that works rather than saying that this research will give me a solution for when you absolutely do this or when you absolutely do that.
So what is that? And this question may seem silly, right?
Yeah.
But what does it look like to say, let's get the Africans involved? The reason why I'm saying that is because we live in the day and time where an African could look like anything.
Sure.
They could be obviously what they are, blacks. They could be Arab. They could be white even in South Africa. And you worked in South Africa.
I did, yes.
All right then. So is their opinion just as valid? Or is it specific to black Africans that you're talking about?
This is such a good question because when I was listening to the segment earlier, that was talking about music, doing this work kind of raises these exact same conversations about where are the boundaries of culture, race, and identity. And we are challenged with that all the time because of our history as black people and as African people. Where do we draw those lines around who should be in the conversation, who is not? When is that based on what you look like? When is that based on what your DNA ancestry test says? Right. So that nuance of what that means, I think, is really important.
Okay.
And so we talk about it in different ways. And so a lot of my research is about categories, about like what categories are you using? Who are you calling a population?
Yes.
Who are you calling African? Who are you calling African American? And so science doesn't even get that right, which is part of the research.
Okay.
And we struggle with that as well. And that's why these conversations are always so difficult and so complex. So in some ways, sometimes we talk about things like sub-Saharan Africa, people
Yes.
might refer to.
Yeah.
Or sometimes we might go down to different levels, like talking about kind of Nigerian or Ugandan. There's lots of research that shows that research projects will use African American data. It has very little relevance to populations in Uganda. So this idea that you have Black data or African data when we are so diverse is actually not really sensible, and it's not scientific. When you're talking socially and culturally about whose voice is important, then yes, if you are a culture that is mixed and blended of many different tribes and people like South Africa might be, then actually there might be something that they want to say about South Africa and their story that all of them talk about, but there might be parts of that that actually the native indigenous people of that land talk about, or the Bantu populations that moved into that area before the European populations came. Maybe it's about them talking about it. So there are lots of different ways. And how people are funded as well speaks to that as well.
Okay.
So we often talk about whether people are kind of born in particular countries, whether they would get particular funding and be seen as kind of African scientists. How you look would never be used.
Expand on that though.
Yeah.
Because say that last point again.
Yeah, how you look we pseudo use it, I think, because as soon as we say African or Caribbean or whatever, I think people assume the way that we look. But I don't think anybody could ever write on a policy that you need to prove who your Africanness or your Blackness based on what you looked like. I think there are assumptions made all the time, and that's a lot of what my work is about. Are those assumptions that people make based on what you look like, what that actually says about your genetics.
So in terms of the funding though, so could that mean that somebody who just claims to be African, so let's just say, I don't know, Sally moves to Nigeria, has kids with Keith in Nigeria, same ethnicity, same English, but now has a Nigerian passport. Would there be scrutiny like with their child's Africanness, if that makes sense?
But the child who's born in Nigeria?
Yeah.
If the child is born in Nigeria and racialized as Black in Nigeria, then I don't think there would be much scrutiny. But there might be something about that funding that's about kind of socioeconomic group as well as that. So again, that's what I mean, that it probably wouldn't come up against it that much because the socioeconomic group of somebody who could move to Nigeria and have kids is that the same type of funding as somebody who kind of grew up in a small village just outside Accra. Like those might be very different people looking for mobility in different ways.
This is interesting. How did you even get into this field?
So I laugh because I was a problem for my family, I think, because I changed my mind about 100 million different times of all the things I wanted to do. So I have always been interested in science.
All right.
And my mum was always kind of a supporter of that as well, which is why I like the Marcus Garvey question, because my mum always spoke about kind of tenets of societies and what Black people needed to be excellent at. And so she was very proud to have, daughters who were thinking about construction and engineering and software and science, and she's an educator. So so I had that support from very early on with kind of science. But also I wanted people to understand science so that they could use it to empower their own lives. And that was kind of always my thing. I didn't really want to be in a lab. I realized very early on, actually, I want to talk about science. I want to make people excited about science. I want to make science feel like a space that we do belong in and that we can take part in, understand and make informed choices with. So I wanted to be a journalist before, a science journalist. So I did undergrad in biology, and then I did my first master's in science communication.
Okay.
So I learned about talking about science and semiotics and science fiction and all of those things, because I thought I was going to be on Tomorrow's World. And
Semiotics, what's that?
so it is the study of signs, and kind of the messages that you can portray by the signs that you use when you speak. So either the types of words or the colours that font are in and those types of things. So it's the message underneath the message.
Yeah.
And so that happens a lot in things like media, in news reports, propaganda, all of those things, that there's a huge science behind actually how do you get somebody to respond to a message in a particular way. That's not just about the words that you use, it's about kind of how you use them and what feelings you might emote from the way that you talk about things. So communications was kind of always my thing. And then I worked for charities, again, charities who were supporting families who had children with long-term health conditions. So at that point, I knew about what a genetic counsellor did.
Okay.
Because I was telling people about it, like, oh, your child has this condition, it's a genetic condition. You should probably go and see a genetic counsellor to talk to you more about that and further testing in your family. And then I met somebody who was one, and they spoke to me and said that my skill, but also my passion aligned with that job type. As I went back to school again, I did a master's in genetic counselling, and then that's how I became a genetic counsellor.
Wow.
And I was 30 at that point. So people thought the education was done, and I decided to go back again. And now here I am again. Yeah.
Two things, yeah.
Sure.
I was obviously on your website reading, and you mentioned something along the lines of preventing, predicting, and managing genetic conditions, right?
Yes.
In a healthcare setting isn't always fair, right? Can you give me an example of a genetic condition that you can prevent,
Yeah.
you can kind of predict and kind of manage?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we talk about, let's start with prevention.
Okay.
We might be talking about the fact that we are aware of a genetic condition that you are at risk of.
Okay.
And what are the options for you to have a child that doesn't have the same genetic condition?
Yeah.
So those are ways that genetic conditions can kind of be prevented.
Okay.
Is that you might have two parents who carry a genetic condition between the two of them, and they're healthy, but if they have a child together, there's a chance that the child would have the condition. And so we have different options for how would you have a child that doesn't have the condition. So do you adopt? Do you have egg donation? Do you have sperm donation? Do you have IVF with a genetic test? Those types of things. So there are ways of stopping the disease from going any further in your family in that way.
Okay.
There are other ways where you might stop the symptoms of the genetic condition. So you might have a particular gene that increases your risk of particular types of cancer. So particular types of kind of breast or ovarian cancer, for instance. So you have the genetic test and you know that your risk is 60% of breast and 40% risk of ovarian once you reach the age of 40. But you have that information now. So you can take chemo prevention type medication, or you might have surgery. So you might say, I've completed my children, I'm going to remove my ovaries. And then by removing your ovaries, you've now removed the risk of you having ovarian cancer. So those are kind of some of the, I guess, prevention ways.
So to cut you.
Yeah.
This is why I was saying to you people, yeah. I'm looking up there at the camera.
I know, I'm like looking at you like, where do I look?
This is why I was saying this is so unique and so important. Because I feel as though, who does that? Who actually takes the time? Don't get me wrong. I do know that obviously there's certain environments, even churches, that may be like, okay, cool, you guys are dating. Let's get you tested. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But who is actually saying, cool? Obviously, I'm not a woman, so I don't know. But thinking, okay, cool. The chances of this happening to me post 50, post 60.
Sure.
So I'm going to do this to prevent this. And like in my head.
How do you get there?
Yeah.
Okay, I could talk about that. Yeah. So I guess the important thing is I've used two examples of genetic conditions.
Yeah.
Last guess, there's probably about 8,000 genetic conditions. So part of my job as a genetic counsellor is not to know every single genetic condition, but is to know that different genetic conditions get passed on in families in different ways. And so my skill is to quickly understand about that genetic condition, how it might be passed on, and help someone who has no genetics knowledge to understand that. How you get to me, though, comes through different ways. So it may be that as a couple, the woman is pregnant, you have your routine scans, have your routine screening, and something says, oh, this is high risk. Let's do a further test because there might be a high risk of Down syndrome. And then you do that test and you find out in that pregnancy that actually this is a pregnancy affected with that condition. So you find out about a genetic condition in pregnancy. That might be when you talk to a genetic counsellor about, okay, well, what are the choices that I have now? What am I going to do now? You might come to me because you have a family history of sickle cell. So you know there are lots of people in your family with sickle cell, or you're from a part of the world where lots of people are at risk of sickle cell. And so you may already have that knowledge, and so you want to know, well, what is my genetic status and would there be a risk? You might get that test done in your local community environment if you live in certain parts of Nigeria, for instance. So you grew up with that information. Yeah. And then you might come and see a genetic counsellor or a sickle cell counsellor and talk about, well, I know that I'm a carrier and so is my partner. So what are my options? Cancer, you may again have a family history of cancer. So you may turn up to your GP and say, do you know what? My mum died of breast cancer at 40. Her sister died of breast cancer at 35. What is going on in my family? And so they will then refer you to a genetic counsellor. I will draw a family tree. I'll ask about the history of the cancer. We work out whether that looks like it could be a genetic reason. And then we think about what tests you should have. You might have an eye condition. Your eye doctor says, this actually looks like a genetic one. Yeah. You go and see a genetic counsellor. It might be a heart condition. It might be. So any bit of medicine, there are conditions that are kind of what we call multifactorial, which just means many causes. And then there are conditions that are genetic as well. So in all different kind of bits of medicine, you might find conditions that are very specifically caused by a gene or a genetic change, and then that's how they kind of end up to us. So we wouldn't say you just walk around and decide that you want to have a genetic test for a thing that there's no indication for.
Do you think it would be a prudent thing for us to start doing, though?
There are two thoughts around this, because as genetic technology has got really good, so before we just couldn't do that. Yeah. So you would see a genetics specialist, a counsellor or a doctor, and we would have to do all of that Cluedo work to figure out, okay, it's so expensive, but this is the gene that I want to test because I've asked all the other questions, done all the other tests. And now the genetic technology is so good that you could just sample someone's entire genome and be like, okay, I'm going to look and see if there's any mistake in there. Yeah. And then I'm going to tell them, okay, you've got a risk of this and you've got a risk of that. It's really easy to do that. It's really hard to interpret it, data. The analysis of that, the amount of data that's generated from that is huge. So the analysis itself is huge. And then sometimes we're not entirely sure. We might get a thing that we don't really know the answer to. You may raise someone's anxiety over something that you can't really explain. Yeah. So there are some people that are like, just do all my DNA, give me a huge file with all of my information on it. I want my genetic information and I'll get somebody to interpret it. That's harder than you think. But from a genetic counsellor perspective, because I think about the thoughts, the feelings, your faith, your morals, whether you're going to share the information with your family, how that's going to affect you. It's not just the science for me, it's how you deal with that. Yeah. Getting a random piece of genetic information and you've got no one to talk to about it fills me with horror because that's just not what I do. Yeah. I think that the conversation goes along with doing the genetics. And so unless there's a risk, I don't think you should go searching for things that would make you more anxious when we might be able to do very little about them. Makes
sense. Do you ever... I'm glad you mentioned the whole morals and faith stuff here, because have you been in a situation where you're talking to somebody who, for example, God forbid, I don't know, their mum passed away at 40 or 50, like you said, from cancer. Sure. Their auntie did this, that, and the third. And this person's saying to you, listen, I don't really want to be here. I know somebody in the village is behind this curse, right? But you're saying it's genetic. How do you cross that? You know what I'm saying? How do you cross that bridge?
These are regular conversations for all we as genetic counselors, this is our bread and butter. Like this is the bigger part of the job than actually the 8,000 genetic conditions that I need to understand. It's how do I engage with a person who has a belief system that may be different from the information that I'm trying to give them, that is trying to make sense of what has happened to them in a way that they can live their life. Me taking away your belief system might not be the best thing to help you live your life. So that's what part of that conversation is about understanding you and your belief system, why you need it, what you're using it for, giving you an alternative, maybe, to, okay, well, this is how you explain it in your way. This is how we explain it. And seeing whether there are any crossovers, blends, anything that can help them for that information. And sometimes it happens. Like I have brought, people who've had a strong Muslim faith. They've taken my information and they're like, I'm not really sure where that stands with my faith. And then I'm like, why don't we arrange for you to talk to an imam? They talk about the Islam with the imam. They come back, they talk to me, and then we come to a decision that helps them. And so that decision may be one that I've given them that they want to take. It may be one that they've decided. It may be to terminate a pregnancy. It may be to continue with a pregnancy. And I have to be okay with all of those things because it's you that has to live that life. Working in Africa and working in the UK, you can imagine where I got more of the conversations about who put muti on who in the family and where that came from. And I don't need to believe it. I need to understand it. And sometimes there's such good information in there. So I said I take family histories. Sometimes without having that conversation, I can't understand your family history in this very Eurocentric way of understanding the family history. I need to know about who died in their sleep or who died of a broken heart or who put what and so and then all their kids died when they were babies. Because that's how you've described that and it's true. But I have a different understanding of what might be the basis of those things. And am I talking about somebody who had fertility problems or somebody who had a genetic problem that meant that their children all died young or somebody who had a cardiac condition and that meant there was a risk of sudden cardiac death. And that's why when they were traumatized, they had a heart attack and died. So it's really important and that's where I think that the benefit of who I am doing the job means that I can open up those conversations in ways that people who have different frames of reference might not do. So when you spoke about things not being fair, these are one of the ways that can affect clinical care. Is because there's no cultural competency about who you're talking to often when you're in professions when they aren't very diverse. So those are one of the ways in which that disparity with how patients are treated can happen.
This is amazing. So, I heard what you said, right? You have to understand it. You don't have to necessarily believe it. But do you believe it?
Do I believe what?
Which
one?
Mutu.
I said a few things.
Mutu.
I think there are things in this life that we do not understand. Even with genetics. Like you talk about genetics and people think, oh, that's like some futuristic science that has all the answers. Genetics is probability most of the time. You know, I'm never really giving a black and white. I'm telling you, it's a 60% chance. That means there's a 40% chance that it's not. And I don't know why it's not, right? So even something, I think one of your guests said, truth is truth, even maths. Maths is context specific, right? Time and space. So even when we talk about physics, we talk about you have to give a parameter, the law of relativity in this space. So that's the way I think about everything, is that's why I don't have to believe it or disprove it, because I don't have the authority to say that you're wrong. I'm just telling you that in my frame of reference, this is what I think. These are the solutions based on the evidence I have. This would be the course of action that I would talk about. But if you want to tell me that actually there is something else that you have evidence of that believes better than what I've said, I've given you the information, I've done my job, and you've made a decision that you can live with.
Beautiful. So what I've gauged from what you've responded is I need to ask you the question off air.
Sorry. You want me to lose my job? All right.
I just want to do what I can do. I got it.
Gosh.
I got it.
Big mic in my face and everything.
I mean, sorry.
I do want to ask you something because somebody
Sure.
in the chat said, can we ask what Sasha's thoughts on genetic engineering
Sure.
is in a sense of trying to remove certain diseases from an unborn child?
Yes. Really important question because we were talking about prevention.
Yes.
And we spoke about one type of prevention. This is another type of prevention.
Okay.
So there's technology which has been developed, and this technology can kind of read the genetic code.
Okay.
And if there's a glitch in that genetic code that we know that causes a disease or a condition, that can be kind of repaired, like snipped out of the genetic code. So your genetic code is essentially, visually, it's a string of numbers. It's actually a string of kind of chemicals. But if you think about like a written code, there's a spelling mistake in that word. There's technology that could remove that spelling mistake. And then therefore, when the body then tries to process, that mistake doesn't exist anymore and it processes fine, right? So that's one way of preventing a genetic condition. At the moment, there are very few conditions that we can do that for, but it's increasing.
Okay.
And at the moment, we have really strict laws about when we can do that.
Okay.
So the Human Embryology and Fertilization Association are the ones who govern kind of the rules on this. And in the UK, you cannot use that technology, I think it's before 14 days on an embryo.
Okay.
Right, so you can only do it once that embryo has been created. You don't do it on what we call the germ cells, so the cells that make the embryo. You don't do it on those cells. So we haven't, as far as science is concerned, you're not allowed to do that. There was a very well-known case with a scientist in China who did this technology, and twins were born from this technology.
Wow.
He went to a science conference, I think it was 2018 or something, went to a science conference, told everyone, blasé, like, yeah, this is what I did. And the scientific community were like appalled and outraged. He went to jail, not exactly for that, because the laws were not written right. It was all to do with kind of other ethics about what he did. So still as a scientific community, doing it on the germline is something that we haven't tackled. I was recently part of a citizens jury, which is where you get members of the public to talk about controversial issues. And so we've had citizens juries on gay marriages, citizens juries on climate control. I was part of a citizens jury that was about genome editing in the germline. And we used, as experts by profession, were families who actually experience serious genetic conditions. Because we feel, or I feel even as a community, that if we were ever to use that technology, the place that would be most acceptable is families who are affected by very serious genetic conditions that have no other hope. And so the conversation was kind of around that, and about whether they felt that this should be technology that should be allowed. And I was kind of in alignment with some of the views that some of the participants had, particularly there was one participant who was, I think she was Ghanaian and a sickle cell sufferer herself. And lots of questions about what is the equity that we have in how genetic technology is used now before we keep inventing genetic technologies that increase the disparity between who can access it and who not. So for me, it's not so much about the technology, it's about whether society is ready to accept the technology. There are all sorts of things that we use now that we thought were just some crazy devil work that we wouldn't have done before. And if we have been ordained the knowledge, it's about how do we use the knowledge responsibly. And I'm not sure if we're in a responsible place to use that knowledge. That technology has been developed for sickle cell, for instance, and we still have huge kind of systemic problems about treatment getting equitably to people who are sufferers of sickle cell. And that's not just about the genetics, that's about the systematic racism around health and disease and genetics. So it was a really long answer. It's not the technology itself that I have the problem with. It's about the morals and ethics of who does it and who does it when and how we use it. Yeah.
Well, to kind of use that example of sickle cell,
Yes.
since that is a condition that predominantly affects Black people, what would be the potential problems that you have with it? Like, surely it would be, for example, us Or well, not necessarily yourself, I guess.
What do you mean problems? As in physical problems, or what other system problems?
Yeah, the system problems.
So there are a few things that I think have always been really interesting to people when I talk about sickle cell, particularly as Black people. When we start talking about what do we mean by Black? So who is at risk of sickle cell? People who have ancestry from the west of Africa, where the malaria belt was.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
So we're talking about Caribbean, we're talking about African American, we're talking about kind of West and Central Africans. I worked in South Africa, not a single patient that I saw, a sickle cell patient, was actually from the southern part of Africa because they don't have malaria there. So historically, they never developed this carrier defense against sickle cell. So again, this pejorative thinking that, oh, it's a Black person's condition. Yes, predominantly the way that we look has something to do with it, but actually there's another reason why it's people from those parts of the world. Yeah. I say that so it's not only Black people that get sickle cell, right? And sickle cell is not the only genetic condition that we get. So there's those two things that we need to understand. But because of that perception, those are the things that then start to affect how somebody with sickle cell is perceived and treated. So if you speak to people in America and in the UK who have sickle cell and have sickle cell in their family, they talk about being denied pain treatment because people have a perception that Black people get addicted to these drugs more than other people get addicted to these drugs. They have people ignoring the pain that they're at because there is a perception that has been written in medical textbooks historically that somehow our pain threshold is different. So there are all these ways that aren't about the condition itself, but they're about the way that you are believed, the way that you are managed, the funding that goes into the research to cure your condition or find treatments for your condition is different based on what you look like and how you're perceived. So, you know, the sickle cell community and sickle cell society have done lots of kind of work and lots of reports kind of over this about all the different discrepancies that they have because of the encounter of the genetic condition and how they are racialized.
I want to ask a question. I want to ask a question about that again, but somebody else, so I don't forget. Is there a link between G6PD deficiency and sickle cell?
I don't know if there's a close link between the two. Okay. I think the link is the historical link because of where they predominate in the world. Okay. So all populations will have genetic conditions that are more prevalent in their populations for particular reasons. And so, as I said, sickle cell became more prevalent in that part of the world because having a trait was protective of that condition. And there were lots of other genetic conditions that we kind of know that there must be some protective reason why everybody in that part of the world seems to kind of be carriers of that condition. So cystic fibrosis happens kind of mainly in kind of Europe and Asian populations. In Jewish populations, they have conditions called kind of Tay-Sachs and things that kind of predominate in their places. And G6PD is one of those that is in that same population. It's also a condition that affects the blood. Okay. So I don't know if they are genetically linked because they're in two different places in the genetic code. Like the glitch is in two different places. They're independent. But it wouldn't be a great thing if they exist together, I would imagine, because they cause kind of similar problems. Although G6PD is a lot easier to manage than sickle cell, but I would imagine there's probably a cumulative effect in how it might affect people who already have a disorder that's about kind of how the blood carries oxygen.
Thank you for the answer. I wanted to ask you, because I do want to kind of... So we got something on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, can we ask if the guest thinks there are any genetic benefits of being with people outside of your race? Example, genetic diversity.
Right, so it's a good question. And the simple answer is yes, because that's how race, but we're going to come back to race. The simple answer is yes, genetic diversity is how the human population, regardless of how you want to define race, it's how we survive, it's how the mechanics of genetics works. So you have two parents, and one makes an egg, one makes a sperm. Half your genetic material goes into the egg, half goes into the sperm. And then when you make a child, they kind of jumble up, what we call recombination, and then they make you. That whole process is about improving diversity in the offspring, right? So just the process of sexual reproduction is about improving genetic diversity. So that's really, really important. If you have people who are too closely related, and I mean really closely related, like parents and siblings, you have large runs of bits of DNA that are exactly the same. They don't have this diversity from two different parents, and that can cause problems. These runs of homozygosity is what they call it. So we can see already in just a very small group that if you don't have enough diversity in your genes, it causes problems. How we define race is really interesting because we don't define, it is impossible to define race using genetics, I think is the thing to say, because race is a social construct that was devised based on how people looked and attached behaviours to how they look to forward a political agenda.
I think that's one of the best definitions I've heard. I agree, every part of that.
So because you start with that, before you start doing the genetic studies to look at what people like, then what happens is people are like, oh, when we do these genetic tests, they're going to show these 5 groups or 7 groups that we said existed. And then you do the research and you're like, no, it doesn't. Like, actually, it shows a lot more than we thought. It showed that people are actually much more similar than we thought, that most of the DNA, regardless of what you look like, is exactly the same. And there are very small bits that are very distinct and different to different populations. The most interesting thing about that, and this is where the disparity comes in again, the most interesting thing about that is populations that are the oldest have the most diversity because they've been around the longest. Where are the populations that are the oldest?
South Africa.
They are in Africa. So when we talk about, is it good for diversity? Yeah, you could just do that within Africa and you would have diversity. It would have nothing to do with how you looked. You could just do, as we did, move from south to north and east to west. And that created the wonderful array of diversity that we have in Africa.
Are you listening, guys?
So I don't think that this very small blip in human development that created some changes in skin colour is the bit of diversity that's going to give you a superpowered child. So there's that. The real life ramifications that has, though, is that historically, lots of that research, because they thought it was a lot simpler than it was done on European populations where the least diversity exists. So the knowledge of actually what is all the capability of our genome is very limited because it's only at one end. And what that means is if you come from a population that hasn't been as well described because of the social history, when you come to see a clinician like me, it's much more likely for those people from those populations, native, indigenous, African, Latin, that if they have a test, they get, remember I said you could have a test and we just don't really know what the information means? That would happen more in those populations. So that's the other area of disparity, is that the knowledge about the DNA in the very diverse populations is actually inverse. And so it means it has a clinical impact. You may not get a good explanation about what's going on genetically. Things haven't been developed, treatments and management on particular genetic changes haven't been developed for you because all of that information is kind of yet to be discovered for lots of our populations.
A blip. That was to describe.
Picking up on that.
Yeah, because I think the person who asked the question, they were just talking about, like, are we down to swirly, innit? And how you got it?
It's swirling the answer.
That's what they're asking.
I mean, again, when I talk about like politically motivated agendas,
What you said,
there is this idea that somehow a beige future is the best future, and I'm just it's irrelevant. I just genetically speaking. No, I can't give you validation for what you may choose to do based on a genetic reason. That is
okay.
It's just that's a drop in the ocean of the things
Alright.
that we should be talking about.
It's irrelevant.
Yeah.
So you're in support of people like Emile to stop talking about, like, keep it in your own because you like the whole thing.
That's not true.
These are just blips, man.
Let's not go too far, right? What I'm saying is there's a difference between, right? So there's a difference between, so this is what touched on the conversation before that I thought was like so interesting, because again, it's about how do you define the boundaries of your culture, your race, and your identity?
Yeah.
When genetics is not your friend, right? It's not going to help you define race.
Yep.
It's a nice, interesting story, but actually, if you put us all on a plot, the whole world, it would just be one big blurred something, and people wouldn't fit into these distinct groups. So we can't say that there was a test that was going to help us to come up with this. So what are the other ways that we think about who we are, what our culture is, what Black means to us, and how we want to protect that, how we want to gatekeep it, when we should and who we should. And I think it's the exact same kind of conversation. It's one that I've been challenged as a girl that's raised in an Afrocentric Rastafarian household, but then is interested in science and genetics. How do I still stand firm on, but I'm a proud Black woman? What does Black mean to me? And so all of those other things, histories and cultures and food, oral histories, stories that have been passed down, these are the things that I protect and hold and define me as a Black woman. That means that I might not be so open to swirling, because those are the things that I value.
Yeah, 100%. Again, are you listening, guys? All right, then. You're dumb.
I'm about to cough.
You want some more water?
I got lots.
All right, good.
How does it not become very difficult to kind of protect those things that you kind of mentioned if there are no lines to say this is ours and this is theirs?
Absolutely. And I think it requires broader thinking about the nuances within our groups and who we are. That what I mean when I say I'm Black, what I mean when I say I'm a Black Londoner, what I mean when I say I'm a diasporan from Jamaica, what I mean when all of those things are different in different spaces at different times.
Yeah.
And I can own all of them and be okay with all of them.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm not in the group. You know, sometimes the bit of the culture that needs to be protected, I'm not actually part of that culture. And so I can support you as somebody who has been racialized in the same way, has a similar journey. We understand each other, and I can be behind here supporting you. But it's to amplify your voice in that conversation. And sometimes I find a lot in kind of growing up in London and stuff, it has changed who is allowed to be the amplified voice of the Black community. And that in itself can also kind of cause problems as well. So it can be challenging, but also there's a difference between gatekeeping individually, having boundaries and values and things that you do individually and that you do at scale. And sometimes they can't always be the same thing. And that's why I guess I'm not challenged, because I stand on that ownership as a person, and then it doesn't cause me those challenges in that way. But when you start to think at scale, yes, it does become challenging. And then that's why we end up in these very heated, complex debates, because now what we're talking about is how do we do that as a group? But then you have to define who is the group.
Exactly. So this may be a silly question, but long term, if you could just decide like this, what would you say is best for us to kind of unify under the banner of being Black, or maybe to be more specific? Because again, like somebody mentioned before about Jewish people and how they're able to gatekeep, because everyone knows what it means to be a Jew, at least a European Jew of a European Jewish descent, right? What does it mean to be Black? Like, you've got people out there who are like 8th Black, 7/8 European, and want to sit down and tell me, but I'm Black too. Like, me personally, I can't have that conversation with you. Yeah, I can't, right? I just can't, because that's foolishness to me. Right? But there's some people who entertain it, especially in America. Because, like you said, it's a political thing. So how then do we actually come to some sort of consensus that makes sense, so that we can actually focus that energy and bring about real solutions?
Because I did so well in the quiz, you think I got answers, innit? So I would say that I lean on, as I said, the fact that I grew up in a Rastafarian household with values of Pan-Africanism.
Yes.
And so why am I gonna get radical under people's thing? So I think when you lean on that, when you lean on kind of those more concrete ideologies about what it means to unify based on kind of history and experience, economics, like all of those things, like tangible things, then you can lay claim to, okay, yeah, actually I am from a people that experience this story and need this and are experiencing the world in this way, are experiencing being colonized in this way. Like, so I feel like you have to talk about concrete experiences, because then if you start telling me that you're one something, and then I'm like, okay, tell me your story, and your story aligns in no way with the story that I know of people who have the shared experience of me, that's the dividing line, because how you have experienced education, how you've experienced healthcare, how you've experienced policing, how you've, like, all of those things are a different story to me based on how you've been racialized. And I think that that's an easier way to think about it. And it would, and, you know, and there may be people who do look completely different to me, but actually have that same story.
Yeah.
So I feel as though we need something a bit more political. And we used to have that in the UK, right? We used to have politically black. And we had so much power when we had that. And then it became black and brown and this and that and whatever, and BAME, and it all just kind of gets like diluted and lost, because that political radicalism that went behind the identity is the bit that we, you know, shy away from because it's not nice. Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
We're very accommodating, aren't we?
Oh man. We are, man. This is why let me behave. But yeah. Let me stop
There's
there.
another question in there. It feels like.
Well, what I was going to ask you is, I agree, right, in terms of the experience. I think that is actually a good way, because obviously, like, if you're not sharing the same experiences as me, then how the hell can you talk about the things I'm talking about? And why would you even be as invested? You can tell me you're as invested.
Yeah.
You might have people like, what's her name? I can't remember her name now. The white woman that wrote White Fragility. Brent? Is it Robin Walker?
I didn't read that book.
I know the book.
Yeah. So she would obviously come across like, oh yeah, I'm fully invested. Let's tell, you know, this, that, and third. But her experience would never be the same as ours.
No.
But then you may get, and this is where I think the difficulty comes. You'll get mixed race people who won't necessarily have the experience as us, but have some sort of an experience, and then say, okay, cool. I'm sensitive to the fact that I'm not as dark as you, so this, that, and the third. But then you get some of us in the community who say, well, but you're not exactly like us. So they feel a bit left out.
Yeah.
But then some people on a different day say, no, you're part of us.
Yeah.
And so it's like, who's deciding this? And this is why it kind of goes back to the whole appropriation thing. Because who is the authority that says this is the line? You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
I don't know, man. And I feel like other races, or I shouldn't even say other races, but other groups, again, like the Jewish community, for example, they don't have this issue.
Yeah. It's very different for groups that are based on faith.
This is it.
So, you know, the Jewish community is huge. There are so many different types of Eastern European ones in Israel, ones in America, people who just have one grandparent who was in Auschwitz. But you can just use the word Jewish and people kind of know what that means. Yeah. And that's partly because of the same political history that actually very early on, people started to see them as a different race. And somehow they have transformed that. I think it's quite, I don't know, not disingenuous. What's the word? I think we should be not so hard on ourselves because that is part of the experience. Yeah. The fact that it is so fragmented and difficult is exactly part of the experience. And so those are the things that we actually need to embrace and talk about. Like, this is actually part of what it means to be black. Yeah. This is why our mental health is higher. This is why it's harder to mobilize. This is why our businesses struggle. Because that experience of finding it hard to unify is because you're a people who were divided and conquered. And so you can't heal that by just blaming yourself that it is that way. I think we need to acknowledge it a lot more. I think we can talk about it a lot more. And the thing I also wanted to say is, if you really understand it, you don't have any problem stepping back when you need to step back. And also, if you haven't had that experience, as we are very aware of, there are people who look exactly like us who have not experienced life in the same way and are not for our interests. So again, when we're talking about drawing these lines, this is another reason why I think that your physical appearance, you know, your kinfolk and your skinfolk, you know, they're not always the same thing. That's why I don't know if that's a really solid ground to stand on. And yeah, you know, I've met unproblematic white people who, because they understand that, can quite happily say, you know what, I have some of this because, you know, somebody was from Trinidad back in the day, but actually that's not my space. And so, yeah, I don't know if I'm answering you.
You are. No, I fully understand what you're saying. And it makes perfect sense. Somebody has asked a question.
Wait a minute. Let me just run through a few
Genetics
questions. Just so you are aware, everybody in the chat, if you want your question to be featured, please at the day after TNB and then follow it up with your question so I can actually see it. I've done a little searchy, and the first one is this.
Okay, so Brent, can you ask her if she works with GSST?
Yes.
What's GSST?
Guys in St. Thomas's Hospital.
Oh, okay.
Did somebody know me?
How old are these questions? 'Cause I think she's touched on them already, innit? Can you ask about incest, please?
We spoke a little bit about that, didn't we?
Why does it affect some more than others?
Okay. Oh, okay. I think that's a different question. Okay. I think I know what that question is. So I spoke about genetically why incest is a problem when you have these runs of DNA that are exactly the same, but how closely related you need to be for that to be an issue. So we're talking about very closely related. So that's what incest would be defined as legally.
Okay.
Because some communities are less accepting of cousin marriages, we define those as incest when genetically speaking or legally speaking, they wouldn't be described as incest because genetically speaking, the amount of diversity between cousins means that there actually isn't a problem with cousins having children unless they have a pre-existing genetic condition in the family. Remember I said, like, if you've got sickle cell in your community, you're more likely to meet another person that has a sickle cell trait and have a sickle cell child. Well, if you're cousins, it's like being in a small population. So it's not that it's about being cousins. It's that you're more likely to have the same genetic condition because you're from the same group of people. So that is an increased risk, but not that high. So everybody has like an increased risk of a genetic condition of about 3%.
Okay.
Just generally walking around. So I carry about 3 or 4 serious genetic conditions. And by chance, I might meet somebody who carries the same thing, and that would be the risk. Everybody has that.
Okay.
If I married my cousin, like a first cousin or a second cousin, I'm probably doubling the risk, which sounds huge when you say double, but what we're talking about is going from 2 to 4 or 3 to 6. So the reason that it's different in different populations is there will be social reasons why some populations have intermarried within family groups or clan groups. And those will often be about for like economic reasons, for so like keeping money within families. There'll be like, because maybe they're from agricultural kind of places where you need as many people working on the land as possible and to keep the land in the family. And so there are often social reasons why those have become accepted ways of having family. You're from very small villages and not many people have the same faith or culture as you. And so you tend to stick together. And so as time has moved on, those reasons are probably not as important anymore. But culturally, we all hang on to traditions that we used to do. And we don't have the reason anymore. But we, as Black people, we know that. We're still hanging on to the tradition and we don't need to do that anymore. So I think a lot of cultures still do that they see it as a really important part of their culture because they've always done it traditionally. But those values of, those needs of kind of economics and farming and keeping money in the like maternal line and all of those things are probably not as important anymore. But no, incest, absolutely. I think across the board is just incest. But cousin marriages, like distant cousin marriages, genetically, it's not so much of an issue. And socially, it just is accepted differently across different populations.
Because I remember a friend of mine, she's Fulani, right?
Yeah.
And she was basically telling me how in her family, cousins, you know what I'm saying? Nothing happens. So, no,
exactly. It's a pre-existing problem. And a lot of the times, that's how we find a genetic condition in a family. Is so when I've worked with patients, somebody will come with a very rare like genetic condition. Like sometimes we've seen like really horrible genetic conditions where children, you know, don't live very long, have really severe kind of mental and physical disabilities. And it's such an unusual condition. And then you do the family history and you're like, oh, actually, like 2 or 3 generations back, there were siblings up there and the branches, but they've carried that same genetic trait because it came from the same person. But then what that gives us is the power to then go to the rest of the family and say, in your family in particular, even though this is a rare condition in the rest of the world, it's actually quite common in your family. And then we can offer testing to everybody in the family. So everybody in the family would know whether they carry that or not. And some people would and some people wouldn't. And then they would know that actually, if I want to lower the risk, I would need to marry somebody who's either not from my family, like not a cousin, or where we've both been tested and we kind of know that we don't. So, sometimes it's once we know about it, it can be managed. Yeah.
Right, next one.
Does her family have Cuban roots? Just making the assumption from your last name.
From the Henriques surname. Yeah. So the history of the Henriques surname is Jewish.
Okay.
Portuguese.
Shalom.
Jewish Portuguese in Spain and Portugal. In order to escape persecution, the Jewish community changed their name from a Jewish sounding name to a Portuguese sounding name. Henriques, or Henriques as they say there, was the first king of Portugal. Wow. And so this group of Jewish settlers there, as a lot of Jewish people did at the time. So this is what, when we talk about what does it mean to be Jewish, so they changed their name. And then they explored. And so they explored across kind of South America and the Caribbean. And so some of them in about the 18th century landed in Jamaica. So Cuba and Jamaica are very close. So it doesn't surprise me that there will be some in Cuba as well as some in Jamaica. Wow. And so in Jamaica, you know, the 21 families that rule Jamaica, Henriques is one of them because very early on they were money lenders. So they have a lot of economic power in Jamaica. And we all look different. So Sean Paul is a Henriques.
Okay.
And so there are some Henriqueses that don't look like this. They tend to be the ones that have the power. And then there are some Henriqueses like me. If there's any Henriqueses out there from St. Anne's, then I'm your family. Because there aren't very many of us. Okay. So somehow we are either related to each other or related to those very first Henriqueses that came to the region. They weren't like, it's not the same as being like a Brown or where there were like huge plantations. They were small groups of people in the Caribbean.
Are these Sephardic Jews?
Sorry, yes. Sephardic Jews.
Okay. Interesting. Brent, okay, not sure if I already asked, but what was her educational journey to get to where she is?
We did talk about it, but I could talk a little bit more. No?
No, if we've done it already.
We did it.
Yeah, you may have to rewind, you know.
Yep.
Sorry. Just how can we best advocate for ourselves when we're likely to require these genetic tests?
Absolutely.
Even as common as sickle cell is, the NHS still hesitate to test genotype.
So my work kind of falls into like 3 big areas because of my experience. So the first was that I knew I was like the only black woman in my profession for so many years. And I thought it would be different when I left the country and I went to South Africa and it was the same. So a lot of my work is about just being visible, and that if there are young people out there who are like, I love science, but I want to work with patients, but I don't want to be a doctor, but like there are other positions. So part of my advocacy for us is to show that there are all spaces we can be in and excel in. So that's one thing.
All right.
The other thing that was really troubling for me was the access that patients have to this amazing service that I think that I'm delivering. And so some of that is about knowing what you are entitled to. Okay. So genetic counselling is a free NHS service that your GP must refer you to if you meet particular criteria or you have particular worries. Okay. If they have questions that you have questions that they cannot answer or are not answering adequately. Like I heard Sasha talk about sickle cell and you're telling me this and then you're telling me I don't need to do that. That's wrong. Okay. And so impress on them that actually, even just to talk, I would like to talk to a genetic counsellor, you must refer me. So there is kind of just that self-advocacy kind of for yourself. Also, there are great kind of support groups and charity groups. I spoke about kind of sickle cell society, thalassemia society. So there are lots of organised groups. There's another group, a group of young people, I can't remember what they're called, who organise around their condition and support and advocacy, and they will help you as well.
Okay.
There are also advocacy places that you can go to. So you can kind of ask Citizens Advice Bureau, and some of them are kind of African Caribbean specific kind of advocacy people who will go with you to appointments or help you kind of get through kind of situations as well. So the help is there if you are struggling to be heard or to get through. But it's hard to find us because there aren't always very many of us. But if you go to the support group for your condition, they'll probably be able to help you signpost to the right place that could help you.
Okay, thank you for that. Hope everyone took note.
Next one is... Oops. Not that one, this one.
All right. Can you ask Sasha if she subscribes to post-traumatic slave syndrome being passed down through DNA?
Yes. So there's lots of so one of the first fathers of epigenetics was a black professor as well, and so a lot of people, there's been kind of this, I don't know, misadvertising that real scientists don't believe in epigenetics, and it's a whole area of study. I know scientists that kind of do that work, so it is completely accepted that the first bit of investigation that we did, remember I said we don't have all the answers. The first bit of investigation that we did on what genes do and what their function are was of a very small part of the genome that we could actually kind of test and analyse. And then actually there's like these huge other bits of the genome that we called at the time kind of junk DNA. And then we started calling it non-coding DNA. And then we realised that actually there's stuff going on in all these other bits that are related to the code but aren't the code themselves. So there's huge branches of science that is about understanding what happens in that bit. And then there are other types of science that also think about what are the things that we inherit that are not just through the DNA, and how does that happen? So there's a branch of science that's called kind of neuroplasticity, which is about how the brain can kind of change based on the conditions that the mother was in. There are branches of science that are about kind of the microbiome, so about the type of microbiology and bacteria that might exist in somebody's like fetal tract. And so when you have a baby, like what comes out with, what is the composition of what they're exposed to, and how does that change their immunity? How does it change, like all of those things? So there's so much to be discovered that's not just about this wonderful code that we kind of figured out. And so I think that post-traumatic slave syndrome is one of the things that we have one way of describing it, but there will be other ways that it is actually being visualized and described in accepted science that actually is just a reflection of exactly what you're talking about. That what can happen to somebody that can actually get passed on, that you can't pick up in the DNA code itself, but it might be somewhere else in these other bits of DNA that we're trying to characterize, or something else about kind of the chemical way that we kind of pass on things through generations. So I think it's a fascinating kind of area, and more will be discovered about what these huge traumatic events in populations actually do for generations going forward.
I'm glad you mentioned this, because I do want to ask you, do you feel like this is, tell me if I'm reaching, or is this a similar thing that you're talking about, where if you go back to African traditions, for example, or even just the way us as in 2024 kind of communicate certain things, we may be talking about certain things in such a layman's way, right? And obviously we kind of label that person as a pseudo-scientist, as just chatting rubbish. But really, there's science behind it.
Absolutely.
But we just don't know how to
unpick it.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. I think one of your contributors spoke about the Adinkra symbols.
Turns out, the what?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. This guy's crazy. Oh my.
Adinkra syndrome.
Yes. So one of your guests was talking about Adinkra symbols and the hidden mathematics that's kind of hidden in those things.
Yep.
And so I think absolutely, layman isn't a term that I like to use. And so I think going into this area, I said like communication is my thing. And so people have this idea that I understand the really scientific parts, and then I can turn it into layman's terms so the other person, these are just different languages.
Yeah.
And so I think that people who study kind of linguistics and language have a lot of the answers for these, there needs to be like this merging of all the different kind of disciplines. So actually understanding language and storytelling, I think, is a really important way to kind of understand kind of how science, maths and technology is woven through kind of different communities. So there's a way that I talk about, being passed on in families and inheritance that's based on a genetic framework. And just like physics, that's in a context.
Yep.
In a different context, like a Native American context, how you talk about inheritance is completely different because it's a different context.
Exactly.
And it doesn't mean you don't understand inheritance. It just means in a different language and a different framework, there are different ways of talking about things. And the art and the beauty of, I think, what I am doing when I'm talking to my patients is finding the connections between those things so that we can then move forward with kind of more knowledge and understanding. There's like kind of a humility. So I teach a lot in the very undiverse community that I work in. I teach a lot around kind of cultural competence and cultural humility. And this is one of the important things, is this very white dominated thinking that you have all the knowledge and no one else has anything that you need to learn is one of the biggest things that we need to break down, even as academics who have been trained in a Eurocentric way. That's really hard for even us to kind of decolonize our own mind into thinking about what are higher forms of knowledge and what are lower forms of knowledge.
Yeah. See, Brent, this is why I always say, when we get into those discussions about mythology and stuff, and I said to me, myth is real. You know what I'm saying? Because it's that same thing. Like, it may sound all supernatural and stuff, but there's something that's being transmitted that's a real thing. It's true, but it's just not explained, I guess, in a scientific, tangible way.
Yet I asked you if it's time to talk about Terence, and you said
no, Terence Harrod, no, because
Terence! I just realised he was talking
Exactly.
about
Can you imagine?
Terence!
Thank you.
No, we're not doing it.
Look at Sasha's reaction. Look at Sasha's
We're
reaction.
having a serious conversation and bringing up Terence.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Talk to me.
1 times
About
1 equals
Terence.
2.
Talk to me.
About Terence?
Talk to me.
Why am I talking about Terence for?
Thank you.
Wow, you see how you've jumped out? The code switching is gone.
I know.
God,
because you said Terence.
Thank you.
Sorry. Is
Because
there a
the
scientific
academics
question
among
about-
us don't deal with foolishness.
All right. Because of the first 1 + 1 is, that's when he's like, I'm switching him off. Nothing else matters. Nothing else. All right, okay. I see where.
Terence didn't have nothing to say for himself, so
Thank
we ain't
you.
got nothing to say for Terence.
Thank
So
you.
wait.
Oh, I'm so happy.
Sasha,
Yes.
I love you.
Yes,
Love you.
yes.
Did you watch all the interviews of
Which-
late?
The interviews of Terence.
Yes.
No.
You think
There we
she
go.
wa-
All
you
right.
think she wasted time?
That's right. We need to continue
No.
the conversation. So she didn't know what I'm talking about. You didn't even know the reference point in which
Brent, get it off your chest. What is it?
No. He sat down with Joe Rogan
Yes.
a couple of times.
Yes.
And the second time, he had a mathematician,
Okay.
Eric Weinstein, I believe his name is,
Okay.
come and sit down next to him
Sure.
to basically sit through some of his ideas.
Okay.
Right? And in that explosive conversation, right?
Yeah.
Eric basically said, hey, this one thing, hey, this might be genius. And I can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay. So there is a phrase that my mother taught me. Even a broken clock is right twice a day.
100%.
So absolutely, we can
And
always
if this
pick sense.
one
We can always
thing
pick sense
can
out of
help
nonsense.
humanity,
We can always pick sense out
if
of
this
nonsense.
one thing can help humanity, right? This broken clock, use it, right?
But we still need to agree that it's broken. So we just give it the space it deserves.
Question. Your introduction to Terence, I don't know where you coming from.
Yeah.
Right? Why did you retort when I mentioned his name? Like, let me know. Because I don't know your introduction to him.
No, it's not a very deep introduction.
Go on.
That's it. Like it's
That's
not,
it?
That's it.
All right,
Like,
so
it's
what
just-
have you seen
I
of
just
Terence that
felt
has
like
you
it didn't-
saying,
it
no,
just
I'm not
felt like it
entertaining
didn't-
any other
It
conversation?
just felt like it didn't fit within the conversation.
Oh, it definitely did, because you were there saying there are different ways to basically
Okay.
tell the truth.
Okay,
That's
sure,
what you were saying.
sure,
There's
but-
conventional science,
we've
conventional
agreed-
math, and then there's things that exist outside of it. He just said that.
But we've agreed on
myth
that
is
now.
Myth doesn't mean it's not real. That's what he just said. So I said,
Terence
are
is
you
not
are
talking
you
myth.
gingering me? Are you asking for permission for me to enter the conversation and drop Terrence?
But we agree now.
I saw so many signs.
We agree now.
Yeah, we agree.
We agree now. Sorry, Brent.
No, that's all right. I enjoy this. Don't worry.
I feel so bad.
I have something for you, right?
Sure.
I have something for you. Let me shake the table a tiny bit, right? Here we go. Amanda, can you read this up, please?
All right. Can you ask Sasha what her view on the science behind the COVID vaccine?
Yeah.
I know this isn't her specific area, so feel free to ignore.
No problem. I can answer what I think most people's question was.
Okay.
Like, how did they come up with one so quickly and blah, blah, blah.
And how effective it
Maybe,
is.
and how effective it was and kind of all of that stuff. So I think the first thing to say is a lot of how pharmaceuticals get to market, like how long things take, is not about the science itself. It's about the bureaucracy around it getting there.
Okay.
So I know the speed was uncomfortable for people, but one of the things that explained that speed is that it was about to be an economical disaster, and the bureaucracy that normally makes people money had to be sidestepped in order to bring something quicker. And the reason that it could be brought quickly was because a lot of the fundamental science, like the RNA science around how the vaccines work, had been done for decades before. So we weren't dealing with experimental in that sense, in that, it's the mode at which those vaccines could work had kind of already been proven. The other thing that was really challenging, which is the same as I've been saying, and is the same for lots of medicines and lots of research, is who we do the research on. Means that we get information about how effective things might be, what might work, what might not work. So there's a big branch of research which is called like pharmacogenomics, which is about how different medicines work in different populations based on their genetic makeup. If we're in a system where the most diverse groups of people are under-researched in terms of their genomics, it has a knock-on effect on whether we know the efficacy of things in that group of people, or whether we are assuming the same efficacy based on the ones that we've already done. And so that is just a universal problem with lots of things. So I completely understand the hesitancy of different populations to be like, I'm not sure if you know how effective this will be in my group because you haven't necessarily studied it in my group. We have absolute 100% concrete reasons to be distrustful of Western medicine and research and how it has treated Black bodies. That makes us hesitant to enter research, but it means that it compounds the problem that we then are under-researched, and then that leads to the disparity, and then again that leads to the mistrust, and then we don't enter the research. So I know that it's a challenging and difficult conversation, but I, for one, sometimes am of the position that I'm like, well, I'm going to go and do this thing because actually, if we don't get more information, we're never going to be equally treated at all because it's a vacuum about what that is for us. And again, we need to respect the fact that we have African scientists, Black scientists, like in the game who can explain these things to you. So again, sometimes this jump that we have to distrust an entire institution is absolutely right. But trust is usually based on an individual. So sometimes trying to seek out those individuals who can help you come to some personal understanding. And I know that helped a lot of people that I kind of know. So no, I'm not a virologist or a vaccine kind of expert, but those are probably some of the conversations that I had around that at that time. So
how many jabs do you get?
How many jabs? Quite a few, because I'm a health worker. So I was there and I was going into hospital. And I had serious illness twice. And I was like, well, either the COVID's going to take me out or the vaccine. And I'm exposing myself to the COVID every day. So like, let me give myself a running chance. And I had absolutely no problems. And I've never had any real symptoms from it at all. So yeah, it was a difficult time, innit, to like make decisions. It was a really kind of pragmatic decision, different to different people in my family. But it's kind of hard without doing it and then looking back 10 years later to actually see what the true effect of some of those things were. So you need, which is another reason that pharmaceuticals sometimes take a long time to come to market, is those studies over time, those longitudinal studies, sometimes they want to do those before they go to market.
Yeah.
And so we kind of had to change the rules slightly because of the dramatic situation.
Yeah.
And so it may take a little while before we kind of flesh all of that
yeah.
stuff out. But absolutely, like myths about it targeting us and like all of those kind of things. I'm sorry to use your word myths, but having looked into it, some of those things were just not true. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for the comprehensive answer.
Is that a way of saying lang?
No, not at all. Good morning, Ramsey. You want to ask the question before you head out?
Yeah, morning. How's everyone doing?
Blessed and
All
highly
good,
favored. Thank
mate.
you.
Good. Hi, Sasha. I just wanted
Hi,
to
Ramsey.
ask, hopefully you haven't touched on it before and I missed it, but I just wanted to ask about your experience dealing with patients who have the BRCA1 mutation.
Oh, okay. I spoke about it
Um,
briefly. Have you finished your question? Sorry.
no, that was it, pretty much.
Yeah.
And like, what advice you would give them, especially in regards to having children. For those who don't know, BRCA1 mutation, especially for women, gives them a higher chance of having breast cancer, triple negative breast cancer to be specific with, which affects mostly people of color. But yeah, just wanted you to expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, no problem. So I did speak about it briefly, but I didn't mention BRCA1. We spoke about cancers having particular risk, and I spoke about some genetic changes might give you an increased risk of kind of breast or ovarian cancer. So my experience in a genetic clinic is that I will either meet women who are already diagnosed and in their cancer treatment, because of the type of cancer, it raises, and the age that they've had the cancer often, it raises questions about whether there was a genetic cause for their breast cancer. And so they may come with a diagnosis and get tested at the same time.
Okay.
And then I then take care of them in terms of the genetics while oncology kind of looks after the cancer. And so then we talk about the other risks that might be associated with the cancer. So we talk about kind of diet and lifestyle. We talk about different types of chemo prevention and when they might want to get information. We talk about surgery. So we talk about options of prophylactic surgery. So that's breast or ovarian surgery to remove the risk and kind of counsel people through those choices about those things. And then we also talk about testing in the family to see if other people are carriers of that genetic condition. That testing happens from the age of 18 because the condition in women, the age of onset is kind of late 20s, early 30s. So we feel that adults should be able to have that conversation themselves to know whether they would want the test because of the implications. And so sometimes I talk to women before the cancer who have had the test, but then they still have those options available to them. So they never have to experience cancer if they may choose to kind of have these decisions. We also speak to men because just because it affects women, it's because women have the bits that the gene affects, but men also have the genetic change, but they don't have breasts or ovaries. So they have, so we do talk to men about BRCA1 testing as well. Often they'll come to us when their daughters are becoming of age and then they'll want to know about themselves. And often, you know, you'll be a man in a family of other women who are affected. So again, when I talk about the genetic counselling is not just about the medicine, it's about the shock, the pain, the guilt, like all of the feelings that go along with having the genetic condition. Sometimes I just talk to people, there's no test involved. We're just talking about the experience of having a genetic condition in your family and what further support you might want to help you with that. Like, is it financial? Is it social work? Do you need further counselling, you know, actual therapeutic counselling to talk about that? So I would say that anybody with a genetic condition, whether you've had it, had a test, someone at risk is at it, you know, a genetic counsellor is to speak to anyone who is affected by a genetic condition. That doesn't mean you personally have it. It means that it's affected your family in some ways. And we have very kind of holistic, family-centric kind of thinking about genetic conditions as well. Ramsey, was that what you wanted?
Yeah, I appreciate the clarity. Unfortunately, I'm speaking from experience because my sister passed away from triple negative breast cancer.
I'm sorry.
And we only found out after that that genetic mutation is hereditary and it's within our family.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just wanted a little bit more light shone on it, and yeah, just I want to repeat your point about pushing for your GP to put you through the genetic test, and because everyone I dealt with in the genetic team have been very supportive,
Yeah.
and they're very, very quick with their comms. So yeah, just to push through that. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, Sasha.
No, thank you for sharing and thank you for, supporting that message as well. Get what you're entitled to and looked after in the way that you need to be. Yeah.
Thank you, Ramsey.
100%. Thank you.
We'll be seeing you on
No
Thursday,
worries.
right?
Bless. Come on.
All right, then.
All right. Love. Peace.
All right.
Last question before we ask the last 3 questions.
Yes. Are there any social cultural practices that you've observed that alter genetics, i.e., does smoking weed affect individual genetic psychosis that can be passed down to their children?
It's a hard question to answer because I would never see a family for long enough to know if these things are, if these things
passed on.
happen. It's really, psychiatric genetics is a really interesting kind of field. So for a long time, the more, I guess, physical genetic issues were the things that were kind of studied in terms of like clinically and the tests and all of those types of things. But there is a branch, particularly a researcher that I know in Canada, who've been doing kind of pushing lots of work around kind of understanding psychiatric genetics a bit more. So what are the genes that can affect, how do we understand family histories when we see them, and what are the other things that kind of add to that. What I would say about psychiatric genetics and the way that I tend to explain it to patients is that if you think of yourself as a glass, and we are all born inherently with things in the glass. And so some people's glass will be kind of only half full, and other people's glass would kind of already be at the top because you not only have family members who might have had a genetic like psychiatric condition that has some genetic component, so that's added into your glass, but also you've had the experience of living in a family that has been affected by psychiatric conditions. And we spoke about like post-traumatic slavery syndrome and all of these things. So these are already mean that you're born with this glass that is a little bit fuller than other people's glass. And then things happen to you in life. So we know that for some people, there is kind of psychosis-induced marijuana use. For some people, there'll be other things that are like additive things that we're putting in this glass. So if you know you were already born with a glass that might be a little bit more full, it might not be wise for you to add extra things in your glass, because once that glass tips over, then we're talking about like a psychiatric episode or but then there are things that are protective of your glass too, right? So then we're talking about mindfulness, we're talking about healthy eating, we're talking about exercise, we're talking about diet. So sometimes it's not any different than me drawing the family tree and being like, he was cancer, there was like, we can do that ourselves. You can look at your family, and whether it's mental health or whether it's diabetes, like things that don't have great tests or information, but you've already got some information about, actually, for me, maybe I need to have a slightly different lifestyle because maybe my glass is a little bit more full in this respect than somebody else's glass might be, more full in another respect. So I can't answer that specifically. There's lots of research still going on about it, but definitely for all conditions, we know that different things will increase the risk. If you know you've got a family history of cancer, maybe smoking's not for you.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you very much for answering that. Like Brent was saying, because we do kind of have to wrap up, unfortunately. And I hope you do come back, man, because we've got so many different things.
Sure.
She'll be back.
100%. Yes. But yes, last few questions that we ask every guest, right? Tell us something that people usually are surprised to learn about you.
I mean, my job is so weird that I think I think most people don't even know it exists. What else? I was play carnival in full costume.
Okay.
You seem surprised, so that was a good one.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay. What's your biggest life lesson?
My biggest life lesson. Let it go and let live.
Okay. I hear that. Let it go and let live. And the last question, typically we ask every guest to answer the questions that previous guests has given them, right?
Oh, okay.
And so we're going to ask you to answer a question.
And then I'll give a question.
Exactly,
Okay,
so the question from the last person is, and this is from Travis J, by the way.
Okay.
As your journey goes forward, what are you doing to protect your mind, body, and spirit on the way?
I think I touched on that just briefly, didn't I? About the glass and the things that we do. So I'm definitely a meditator. I am definitely someone who tries to be mindful. I am someone who limits alcohol and meat at certain times, kind of in the week or in the month. And I am a joyful person. So essentially, my biggest asset, I think, at my resilience through life has been my ability to laugh from the soles of my feet and dance like nobody's looking. Like I'm just a joyful person, and I just try to keep manifesting that joy where I can, and that has protected me.
Which ties into what Sase was saying, isn't it, Brent? Joy, just being able to experience joy is the highest form of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Black power, man. Black power.
Go, we're here for it.
All right, man. Thank you so much, Sasha, for coming. Again, like Brent says, you need to come back again.
Okay, no problem.
All right.
She'll be back.
All right. So,
wait. You first of all, happy belated birthday.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And
I didn't ask that question.
oh, sorry, go on.
No, as in to leave a question for the next person.
Ah, sorry.
Oh, gosh, I'm under pressure because that was a very, very deep question. What kind of... And I don't know who the guest is going to be either, do I? So what question would I ask? I think I want to ask that question about identity because it has been such a big question for me. So how do you tie together the different fabrics of your existence to give you a strong sense of identity?
Okay. I like that.
Like a lot. All right, we've given that its moment of silence. Cambridge, you said you wanted to talk just a few words about Cambridge. And obviously, I know you through Chike, innit? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you meet?
We're both PhD students at Cambridge.
All right.
So
collectors, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, you will not be surprised to know that there aren't an abundance of black people at Cambridge. And so I met Chike when Sir Simon Woolley, who is the first black dean of a Cambridge university, he holds a Black History Month ball once a year. And all black students are invited to this ball, and he brings all his like mover and shaker black friends. And it's just like nice for as students to kind of meet people who are like, oh, I started the first offshore oil rig in Nigeria and stuff. So we all just schmooze around, and he has kind of special guests. And Naomi Campbell was the guest last year, and Chike was on my table. So he was on the table in front of me.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I was just on a table with people, had a nice conversation, and then a lot of the...
But I was there that time. I didn't see you.
I looked amazing, so I don't know. It's probably because I look so plain now, but I pulled out stops. People told me Naomi was coming there with some bubble braids with gold and a big red dress.
Swanning around.
Swirling. I thought I was the queen. Anyway, I met Chike that day, and then we just stayed in contact. So we have, so not only like Cambridge and PhD alignments, but obviously because I'm a Soca girl and he's from Trinidad, and and I make a good rum punch. So we just stayed in contact. Yeah.
Amazing. And your thoughts?
My thoughts on Cambridge. Yeah. Well, I'm an East London girl from a Rasta family, so charting down Babylon has kind of been my whole life. So I always like to impress on people. I never woke up and begged Cambridge nothing. I lived my life. I walked in my divine purpose. I held my values true. And the reason I am at Cambridge is because of the work I was already doing. And somebody contacted to say that there was a research fellowship that was about the things she had heard me already speak on, and would I be interested in applying? And that happened to be hosted with Welcome Connect in Science and Cambridge. And so there are great things about Cambridge, but there are challenging things about the institutions that we have to live in and navigate. And so I have those challenges personally and professionally. And so I have never embedded or acculturated myself with Cambridge. That's all I want to say now.
Amazing. Thank you.
I hear you, man.
Thank you very much.
Man. Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Headlines.
Last headlines. Don't worry, people should be back. All right.